Welcome back to the VRH show. I'm thrilled to welcome a guest whose career and contributions to mental health, trauma, prevention, and resilience are truly remarkable. As the managing director of Warren Larkin Associates, he continues to lead the way in advancing trauma informed practices and promoting resilience. His expertise includes extensive work on adverse childhood experiences and the development of innovative approaches to improve mental health care. Dr. Warren Larkin, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Dennis. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, thanks for lending us some of your time. So let's kick this off by you telling us your background, your trajectory in life, and how you ended up doing what you're doing. So what sparked your interest in mental health and what drew you to specifically to the area of trauma?
Well, I think mental health generally when I grew up, was something that was a subject of considerable stigma, really. So I think observing that was really interesting to me growing up. Why did people with mental health issues or people who presented as different, why did they get a hard time? Why were people uncomfortable with that? So I found that fascinating. I guess the second thing that made me interested in mental health was university. So during my time at university, I observed various friends become unwell, become mentally unwell. And again, that fascinated me because I was kind of thinking, well, one minute this person's living their best life, university, and the next minute they're struggling terribly and they're in a lot of distress. And bit by bit, you start to realize that the origin of their problems is firmly rooted in childhood trauma. So that was kind of a shocking and kind of insightful period, understanding that bad things that happen to people can actually influence their well-being, their mental health, their relationships, their ability to function. And then when I left university with my first degree in psychology, it kind of made sense for me to get some experience working in mental health. And as a result of that, I ultimately decided to apply for clinical psychology training. So that's my kind of career pathway in a nutshell.
And I understand, Dr. Larkin, early in your career, you work in asylums. So what lessons or insights do you take from those formative experiences?
Well, I know your kind of viewers are probably wondering how possibly I could have worked in the asylums, given that I look so youthful. But I just have good makeup artists and technicians that make me look so young. But no, I was 22. I was 22 years old when I went into Prestwich Hospital, which at the time was one of the last asylums. It was one of the biggest asylums in Europe when it was fully functioning, with about 5,000 patients there. And I went in there at the age of 22 as my first NHS, or my second NHS assistant psychologist job. And I was kind of surprised because I thought hospitals were those places where people went and got better. But I was working with people that were in their 60s, 70s and 80s and had been there for all their adult lives. Some people had been there for 30 years. Some people had been there for 40 years. Some people had even been there for more than 50 years. So I was kind of shocked and astonished that these people were there, for so long. But secondly, that the problems that we're having didn't seem to be addressed or resolved in any meaningful way, because 50 years later, they're still suffering. So that was a kind of a real eye-opening experience. So then I looked into some of the histories of people that I work with, and what I found out was they went into hospital for things that you wouldn't really today consider a reason for hospitalizing someone. So some of the patients that I knew went into hospital because they had a child out of wedlock. They weren't married and had a baby. Some of the people went into hospital because they had things like panic attacks. So today we'd call them panic attacks. Back then, they were seen as a sign of some kind of mental breakdown. Postnatal depression was another thing. Being a refugee after the Second World War, there's a lot of people came from Northern and Eastern Europe and were homeless. So lots of the people ended up in hospital were people that were seen as socially undesirable or unacceptable. So yeah, there's a lot of lessons from that period, but I guess what's very clear is that institutionalizing people and treating them solely with medication or even more brutal treatments like electroconvulsive therapy wasn't a solution. Even if you do it for 50 years, it's not a solution. So, getting to know people, you start to realize that the only thing they've really got in common is something bad happened to them, something very stressful happened to them. So that's kind of the early kernel of my interest in trauma, really.
Absolutely. And of course, I understand, Dr. Larkin, that you've worked side along some of the heroes in the field. So can you share a bit about that experience and how it shaped your journey? Of course, aside from, those experience working in the asylum.
So that was when my interest in trauma started. And as a result, I started reading a lot about trauma and
Mm-hmm.
psychosis, mental health. And I was very lucky that I worked in Manchester, which was one of the centres of that were pioneering the application of cognitive therapy, which was originally designed by Professor Beck to work with people with moderate and mild to moderate anxiety and depression. So the people I was working with in Manchester were pioneering the application of CBT for psychosis and family approaches for psychosis. So I was very lucky to work with lots of the people I read about in the textbooks and who'd written the textbooks. And I also got to meet Professor Beck a number of times as well, who was very interested in how colleagues in Manchester were applying cognitive therapy approaches to an area that he hadn't envisaged when he created the approach. So, yes, I was very lucky. I had a tremendous set of formative years in the NHS, and academically and clinically, learn from some of the leaders in the field, really. I don't want to name names, Dennis. I don't want to embarrass anybody, but
Yeah. Of course, fair enough. And of course, I understand, Dr. Larkin, that this experience kind of crystallized. And so this inspired you to write a book in 2006, which you've edited and published about trauma and adversity. So tell us about that book. What was the key message?
Yeah, well, that's about it. So here, product placement, you see. So this is the book.
Very good.
Trauma, Psychosis, New Directions for Theory and Therapy, edited by myself and my boss at the time, Tony Morrison, who was probably one of the heroes that I was talking about, and alongside people like John Reed and Richard Bentall, Marius Roman, Sandra Escher. So all of those people were kind of very prominent in the thinking about psychosis as having its origins in psychosocial and relational causes and origins, so basically life events, bad things that happen to people, trauma. So all of the people that contributed to that book were kind of leaders in their field, looking at the way we can apply psychological therapies and psychological theory to this, what was then regarded as a severe mental illness that was kind of intractable and had a poor prognosis. The people I was working with very much pioneered the early intervention in psychosis approach, and very much we're all thinking very, very hard about the fact that, this idea that it's all about faulty genes and inherited susceptibility and about faulty brain chemistry. This biological reductionism that was attributed to psychosis was very much something that the people I worked with and myself were challenging. And we were trying to come up with a compelling narrative that said, actually, when you look at the evidence, there are bigger relative risks and bigger increases in odds of developing psychosis and other serious mental health issues if you've been exposed to childhood trauma. In fact, the evidence for those causes and those contributions to psychosis are far greater than the genetic evidence or the biological evidence around neurochemistry. And we see today that Joanna Moncrief's just published a paper. I just written a book, actually, just published it. But she, exposed the fact that a lot of the studies that were so-called accounting for this selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor theory of depression, and the idea that depression is caused by not having enough serotonin, there's virtually no evidence for that, So there are colleagues that are working around psychology now that are trying to dispel some of these myths. And back in the day, the idea that psychosis was caused by having too much dopamine was quite prominent. And the idea that trauma was relevant to the subject was was actually really controversial. So yeah, so when we published the book in 2006, it was seen as quite controversial. Whereas today, in NICE guidelines for psychosis, it says very clearly there's an overrepresentation of trauma in the life experience of people with psychosis. Therefore, absolutely, we should assess them for trauma. So we've come a long way, I think.
Absolutely. And after many years in the NHS, as you've mentioned earlier, Dr. Larkin, you moved to establishing Warren Larkin Associates. So tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, so I worked in the NHS for 24 years, and the last 5 years of my career was as clinical director for Children and Family Services. So I kind of had a very niche clinical career focusing on trauma and psychosis and CBT. But then I went into this broader public health system leadership role where I was responsible for things like health visiting, school nursing, sexual health, speech and language therapy, physiotherapy, CAMS, first episode psychosis. So I got a different perspective. I got to see the bigger picture, the bigger machine, which was really, really helpful. And I developed a real strong interest in prevention in the early years and the contribution of investment in the early years in terms of lifelong health. So I guess I came to this conclusion that a lot of what I did in my clinical career was picking up the pieces. And we have to do that, and we have to be good at doing that, and we can be better at doing that. But actually, my leadership experience taught me that we can do more with prevention. We can do more with early intervention. So when I left in 2017 and set up Warren Larkin Associates, that was very much my mission, was to bring stress, trauma, and resilience science to organizations in order to prevent harm to staff and service users, in order to support well-being. So moving away from a focus on pathology or pathogenesis and focusing more on salutogenesis, or the promotion and preservation of health. And I continued the specialism through my whole career, which was focusing on trauma and recovery. So I applied that science rather than sitting in a room with an individual or a family. I applied all that knowledge and experience to creating solutions for organizations, for services, for regional systems, both in the UK and abroad. So we started off by focusing on routine enquiry. So how do we ask people that we're assessing, trying to help? How do we ask them about their past trauma? And how do we do that in a safe and sensitive way that feels therapeutic and helpful? So we started off very much focusing on that work. And then we expanded our program of interventions to what is today a 7-part trauma and resilience informed methodology that we apply to huge, complicated organizations and systems, as well as to, smaller individual services or charities, and across all sectors. So we don't just work in the NHS and social care. We work in criminal justice, in education. We're currently leading a randomized control trial of trauma-informed interventions in secondary schools in England, which is funded by the Home Office and the Youth Endowment Fund. So yeah, the theme continues. The theme continues.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's really good that you're gathering evidence and examples of the impact of your model, the routine inquiry in practice. But I was just wondering, Dr. Larkin, why is it that despite the strong evidence linking adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, to health and mental health outcomes, why is it a standard practice? Why isn't it a standard practice?
That's a very good question. And I think what we know, every time I do a workshop on routine inquiry, someone will say, I don't want to open a can of worms or Pandora's box. And I always say to people, there is no can of worms. The person that you're asking about what's happened to them already knows what's happened to them. So it kind of exposes this fallacy that if we ask someone about something that's happened to them in the past that's very sensitive, it'll be shock. It'll be devastating to them. When actually they're probably thinking about it quite often. This is something that happened to them that was very painful. And actually, I think the reason that it's not standard practice is that, number one, most staff have not had any training on how to do that. So they fear upsetting the person. They fear they might make it worse. They might destabilize that person if they're already in distress. Sometimes I think professionals worry about getting it wrong or dealing with the safeguarding implications of that conversation. Or they might worry about, well, what do I do next? Because I'm not a therapist or a psychologist, so what can I do? So I think there's some of the barriers. But what we know is if we don't ask people, people struggle to tell, because often people who've been traumatized, especially in childhood, blame themselves for what happened, or there's shame attached to it, or there's embarrassment, or they fear they're not going to be believed, or they worry that they've tried to tell in the past and it wasn't heard, they weren't believed. So there are so many barriers to people unilaterally disclosing. And we know that there's a study by John Reed and one of John's colleagues in New Zealand in 1998, where they found that if they observe standard practice in admissions in a hospital in Auckland, 8% of people voluntarily disclosed childhood abuse. But when they included a set of questions about this in the assessment process for the next 100 people, 82% of people disclosed physical, sexual, or emotional abuse at some point. So if we don't ask, there are so many barriers, and people very rarely choose to tell us. But if we ask in context of an assessment or some sort of getting to know you process, people expect to be asked, and people are quite happy to tell most of the time. And if they're not ready, they at least know that you're interested in this subject and it's okay to talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
I'll stop there because I could talk about this all day, obviously.
Yeah, I could understand. And of course, if people are interested about your motto and about the work that you've done, your book is there, and I'll put the link to the description also.
Wonderful.
People can read it, a comprehensive work that you've done. But your work at WLA, Dr. Larkin, emphasizes co-creation and relationship building. So how do these principles drive change in the organizations you work with? Because I understand you work with both public and private sector organizations. So what I'm alluding to is, how do you balance the differing needs of these sectors?
Yeah, so we've got a kind of, as I said, a seven-part change methodology, and basically over the last few years we encounter some really common problems. So I'll not go through the whole 7 aspects of it, but we encounter very often that organizations feel that their staff know about trauma and adversity already. But when you survey people, you find out actually it's a much lower percentage than was originally believed. So knowledge is inconsistent. Most organizations are plagued by stress, sickness, poor retention, poor morale. People are exhausted. So that's another set of issues that we come across really commonly. So part of our work is about improving the way we can find out about what happened to people, so we can talk more openly about trauma as part of our assessment, and we can find out about what happened to people. Therefore, we can give them the right help. Some of our work is about providing workers with those skills. Some of it's about providing the right knowledge and information. So a bit like safeguarding, if you work with people, you should know about trauma and its consequences, or you should know about how trauma can show up in people's presentation, and the fact that trauma and adversity, in particular childhood adversity, accounts for around £42.8 billion of healthcare resources every year in England and Wales. So it's a huge problem, and trauma and adversity increases the risk of you developing physical health problems, mental health problems, social problems, going to prison, doing poorly in education and work, being involved in violence, being addicted to drugs, having multiple chronic physical healthcare conditions. So it's essential knowledge. So we spend quite a lot of time tailoring that knowledge to different sectors. So if we're working with education, we tailor it to that context and that setting. If we're working with policing or probation or health visiting, we develop an understanding and an insight into that sector and that work experience, that kind of the roles that people play relative to the system. And we shape our offer based on a set of solid principles and, well understood science, but we shape it to that context. So we very much, it's not a one size fits all, it's very much a bespoke implementation based on the 7 parts of our kind of change methodology. And the final thing I'm supposed to say about that is one of the things we're really keen on is building the evidence base, because outside of the clinical application of trauma theory, CBT for psychosis, CBT for trauma, EMDR, outside of those things, the evidence is we're only just building the evidence base for trauma-informed practice or trauma-informed care, this very, very popular term. So I think we have to, people like me who do this work for organizations and services, we have to be really careful about measuring what we do, because if we can't prove that we're making an impact, if we can't show that it's replicable, it's reliable, it's based on sound principles, then how is anyone going to, say if we have a real great success in West Yorkshire, for example, with a particular program, we've got to be able to evidence it and replicate it and scale it, if it's been really impactful. So we've got to, I think evaluation is one of those areas where we've got to try really hard in this movement that is called trauma-informed practice. I think we've got to focus more on that.
Absolutely. Now, lovely talking to you, Dr. Larkin, but before we wrap up, let's end this on a lighter note with some quick fire questions to get to know you a bit better. So the first quick fire question is, what were you afraid of as a child?
I was afraid as a child? That's a very good question. Lots of things, I think, is the short answer. Probably spiders. I think probably spiders. Still don't like them a lot.
And what is your favorite word in another language?
Favorite word in another language? Gelato.
Which is an Italian word, I suppose.
Indeed.
And if you haven't been the managing director of WLA, what would you have pursued in your life?
That's a very good question. I think I would quite like to have been a musician. Having said that, I hated playing the violin at school, but now I play the guitar, so I'm kind of trying to turn things around in my direction. So yeah, I love the idea of being a musician, although I'm sure the glamour of it is not what you see on TV. For most people, I'm sure it's a slog. Yeah.
Yeah, or a gelato shop owner. And finally, the floor is all yours. Yeah. The floor is all yours, Dr. Larkin. What should people take away from today's conversation?
I think that it's important that everybody who works with people in a helping context needs to understand the role of stress. Stress can be healthy, it can be unhealthy, it can create harm, it can create damage and become toxic. So I think one of the biggest drivers of health or ill health, social problems, violence, addiction, the cost that we're seeing in society to healthcare, social care, education, policing, I think a lot of that pain and suffering and cost can be avoided. So I think we should do more around prevention. We can do a lot to prevent childhood trauma. We can do a lot to mitigate the impact of childhood trauma. And as a result of 25 years of research into adverse childhood experiences, what we know is that there's a dose-response relationship. So the bigger the dose of adversity, the worse the outcomes tend to be at a population level, unless it's mitigated by some kind of resilience assets. So I think my message is we can do more to prevent childhood adversity. It's so predictable. We understand it. We can do more to prevent it. There are a lot of preventative interventions that are effective on a human level, but also cost effective. I think there's also a lot we can do to intervene earlier. And early intervention obviously has so many benefits, both in terms of the human cost, reducing the human cost of illness, but also the economic cost. And I think the final thing that we need to be able to do is to give people access to evidence-based interventions sooner, because currently prevention, there's not a lot of our resources spent on prevention. Not every professional understands trauma and adversity and its implications and how to resolve it. A lot of professionals don't get any therapeutic skills in their basic training, but they're dealing with really complicated people. So one of the things we do a lot of is train people in basic therapeutic skills, just to enhance their confidence and their repertoire, whether they work in a school or a health visitor or a police officer. So I think, we're dealing with increasing complexity. And I think ultimately we got to get to a place where, and this might take a generation, it might take a generation, but we've got to get to a place where we're investing in preventative interventions that can reduce childhood adversity and child abuse. We're investing in the early years. So we're trying to help parents and communities raise their children in safe, healthy ways that maximizes the well-being across the life course. We've got to get back to early intervention, giving people the right help that they need when they need it, as opposed to them sitting on a waiting list for 2 years and getting worse and more complex issues. And ultimately, the reason why I think we rely so heavily on medication in our society is that psychological therapies are just not available in the same way as medications are. So your GP doesn't have an equal choice between trauma-focused CBT and or EMDR and medication. Often they only have this option available. So I think there's got to be a parity of esteem between mental health care and physical health care. And I think we've got to take a more holistic approach rather than focusing on a medicalization of distress. We need to understand that very often the problems that we're dealing with in society, in healthcare, in policing, in education, they're the consequence of bad things happening to people. So we have to recognize that we can't medicalize that, and we can't prescribe our way out of that, or we can't arrest our way out of that, or exclude children out of school to fix that. We've got to see the biopsychosocial picture. We've got to see the holistic picture. We've got to train professionals to understand and be skilled at dealing with that as a consequence.
Absolutely. That's a fantastic note to end on. That's it for us. Your work on trauma, adverse childhood experiences, and the development of the REACH model has been incredibly insightful. Dr. Warren Larkin, it's been an absolute pleasure having you here on the DRH show, and I look forward to seeing how your initiatives continue to shape the future of mental health. Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis. It's been a pleasure.